Good evening. Today let's discuss remembering the unsung black heroes from 9/11. The terror attacks 22 years ago shifted the trajectory of the nation. The nation forever changed 22 years ago when 3,000 people were unalived in New York City, at the Pentagon, and in a field in rural Pennsylvania in terror attacks orchestrated by Al Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden on September 11, 2001. Ever since then, the horror of it replays like a bad movie on the anniversary, and fresh wounds are reopened. Here we remember some of the unsung heroes of color who stood on the front lines during and following the devastating attacks on 9/11. Rodney Gillis. NYPD Sergeant Rodney Gillis was unalived in the terror attacks on the World Trade Center while he was saving people. That was what Rodney would do, former NYPD detective Madeline Lawrence recalled in an interview with USA Today. Lawrence said Gillis always put others first, as evidenced by how he jumped to action even though he wasn't on duty that day. He was our sergeant, and he looked out for us, Lawrence added. He appreciated the magnitude of those buildings. Black firefighters. The stories of a group of African American firefighters, Vernon Cherry, Terrell Coleman, Andre Fletcher, Keith Glasgow, Ronnie L. Henderson, William L. Henry Jr., Gerard Jean Baptiste, Carl Joseph, Keith Roy Maynard, Sean E. Powell, Vernon Richard, and Leon W. Smith Jr., who gave their lives at the World Trade Center site to save others on 9/11, have gone largely untold. Craig Kelly, a former firefighter and grief counselor who worked with the fallen heroes' families, was compelled to chronicle the aftermath of their unalivement and made his research into a documentary, All Our Sons, Fallen Heroes of 9/11, which was released in 2004. The tribute memorializes the fatal day's heroic lives and what they meant to their communities. Regina Wilson was also working as a second-year FDNY firefighter during the 9/11 terror attacks. We had to draft water from the river in order to put fires out, Wilson told the Afro News. We spent most of the time trying to collect it and hook it up to the Marine units so that they could draft water to put out some of these buildings fires and car fires all over the place. You just didn't even know where to start. Wilson said the aforementioned black firefighters will never be forgotten. Every year we go and pay our respects and pay homage to those black members that passed away because the media doesn't recognize their lives and their purpose, Wilson added. Jason Thomas. U.S. Marine Jason Thomas, who was 32 at the time, ran toward Ground Zero at the World Trade Center with only a flashlight and a shovel, and made the decision to help as many people as he could. He ended up unearthing a pair of police officers buried beneath 20 feet of debris. But then Thomas disappeared. No one knew of his identity until he was finally unmasked 4 years later. Despite his heroics, Thomas was portrayed as a white man in the 2006 film World Trade because, well, systemic racism. The filmmakers later apologized for their inaccuracy, but Thomas, ever the patriot, just laughed it off and said he didn't want to shed any negativity on what they were trying to show. Children aboard Flight 77. Way too young to understand the evils of the world, 3 bright lights were permanently dimmed on 9/11. Asia Cottom, Rodney Dickens, and Bernard Curtis Brown II, all age 11. The children were aboard the fateful Flight 77 when it crashed into the Pentagon. The precocious youths had been handpicked to represent 3 middle schools in the Washington, D.C. area, and traveled to the Channel Island National Marine Sanctuary near Santa Barbara, California, to participate in a National Geographic Society research project called Sustainable Seas Expedition. The children were accompanied by a teacher and 2 National Geographic representatives. Sadly, all of the passengers on Flight 77 were unalived. the children and their chaperones' memories were honored when the then mayor of Washington, D.C., in conjunction with the D.C. Public Schools, the Department of Parks and Recreation, the National Geographic Society, the Anacostia Watershed Society, and the Earth Conservation Corps turned the islands of Kingman and Heritage into sanctuaries. Part 2 in the comments. Part 2. Leroy Homer Jr. Leroy Homer Jr. grew up in Long Island and always dreamed of becoming a pilot. So when he began flying for United Airlines in 1995, his dream was finally realized. On September 11, 2001, Homer, 36, was assigned to Flight 93 from Newark, New Jersey to San Francisco. 4 al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked his plane, but after learning about the other crashes at the World Trade Center and Pentagon, Homer, along with some of his crew and a few passengers, organized a takeover. During the struggle with the terrorists, the plane crashed in a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Homer, a hero indeed, was gone way too soon. Daryl Warner, Chief Technician in the Gross Anatomy Lab at the City College of New York and scientist Daryl Warner is a special hero who had a unique job. He was the country's only African-American diner, D-I-N-E-R, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, making him responsible for locating donor bodies to be utilized by medical school students. When 9/11 took place, Warner did not think of himself or his health or gave thought to the thousands of victims who fell at the hands of terrorists and needed to be identified and brought back home to their loved ones. Therefore, Warner traveled every day to Ground Zero to volunteer and help identify the remains of the deceased for the New York City Medical Examiner's Office. Warner is truly the epitome of a hero who has continued to dedicate his life to science. Marcy Borders. And who could forget Marcy Borders? The dramatic image of her covered in soot from the fallen towers defined the 9/11 attacks. She died of stomach cancer in 2016, an illness that may have been brought on by the toxic fumes emitted from the terror attacks. The illness is believed to be the blame for similar unalivements in the other survivors from that day, including hundreds of NYPD officers. The Bayonne, New Jersey native worked at Bank of America on September 11, 2001, when terrorists attacked the Twin Towers, where she worked on the 81st floor of Tower 1. She managed to escape just minutes after the building's collapse, emerging covered in dust and powdered concrete. She was brought to safety in a lobby nearby. Agence France-Presse photographer Stan Honda managed to snap a photo of Borders, who became known as the Dust Lady before her true identity was confirmed. Her image served as a stark reminder of a day that shifted the trajectory of an entire country. Black journalist. Veteran journalist Richard Prince compiled a number of attestations from his fellow black journalists who were working on the morning when the Twin Towers were struck by terrorist-steered airliners 22 years ago. From heralded newsrooms like CNN, The Washington Post, The Associated Press, and others, September 11th was a day in which black journalists were tested as never before, Prince remembered in 2001. In a series of vignettes written by or about black journalists who were covering the terror attacks, it became clear how much their race factored. I was the only black producer for any of the news networks, Jennifer Thomas recalled in 2021, about working at CNN on 9/11. You don't think of the enormity of that, but you know that you bear a great responsibility. I don't have a choice. I don't have an opportunity to mess up. When you're going around doing specials, no one's coming to me to ask me. I was there, but no one's necessarily coming to me. But you're doing your job and you're doing it well. And then you recognize the significance of it later. As we see the commercials, as we see the news broadcast, as we see the post across social media, as we come in contact with people saying never forget, and people having the privilege to say that during this time we were so unified and everyone put down their political stances and everything to unify as one. Once again, we are slapped in the face with the revisionist whitewashing of history. Are we forgetting an entire community of people who were placed under attack for a handful of people who weren't even a part of their community, who did not share their beliefs? But because of the narrow-minded, purely ignorantly educated masses at the time, they didn't unify to make the United States better. Far too many unified, as they always do, in hate. And in their unification, they overlooked so many heroes, so many that was sacrificed for their next hashtag never forget. Until tomorrow.